What happens when a single glance at a family heirloom shatters everything you believed about your past? For Emma Chen, a 29-year-old cook struggling to keep her family's restaurant alive in San Francisco's Chinatown, that moment came when she served tea to the most ruthless casino mogul on the West Coast. For Vincent Ashford, a man whose gambling empire stretched from Nevada to Macau, it was the beginning of questions that would unravel his family's carefully constructed legacy. She was just trying to survive another slow Tuesday evening. He was just another wealthy businessman looking for an authentic Chinese meal away from the tourist crowds. But when Emma noticed the antique jade dragon pendant hanging from his platinum watch chain, identical to the one her grandmother had treasured until her dying breath, a buried secret began to surface. This isn't just a story about money and power. This is the story of how a chance encounter in a small restaurant exposed 50 years of lies, betrayal, and the systematic destruction of a Chinese-American family whose only crime was refusing to abandon their ancestral home. The Golden Phoenix restaurant sat wedged between a souvenir shop and a traditional medicine store on Grant Avenue, its red lanterns casting warm light onto the narrow sidewalk below. The building had housed the Chen family restaurant for 3 generations, and every scar on its wooden floors, every stain on its painted walls, told the story of immigrants who had built something lasting from nothing. The faded photographs lining the walls showed the evolution of Chinatown through decades of change. Old men playing xiangqi in Portsmouth Square, lion dances during Chinese New Year celebrations, and countless family gatherings that had taken place within these walls. Emma Chen moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, her movements flowing between tables like a dancer who had performed the same routine for years. She refilled teacups without being asked, cleared plates with minimal disruption to conversations, and somehow managed to make every customer feel like they were dining in her own home rather than a commercial establishment. At nearly 10 o'clock on a Tuesday, only 3 tables remained occupied. An elderly couple sharing chow mein and reminiscing about their courtship in broken English and Cantonese. 2 college students splitting the check on their dim sum while frantically studying for midterms. And a businessman in an expensive suit who sat alone at the corner table, staring at his phone with the intense focus of someone closing multi-million-dollar deals. The restaurant was bleeding money and everyone knew it. Emma's father, David Chen, had tried to hide the severity of their financial situation, but the mathematics were unforgiving. The rent had increased by 40% in the past year as Chinatown gentrified around them. Trendy fusion restaurants and upscale cocktail bars were moving in, attracting tourists willing to pay premium prices for authentic Asian experiences that bore little resemblance to the genuine culture the Chen family had been preserving for 60 years. Young tech workers could afford $20 cocktails infused with lychee and ginger, but they weren't interested in the traditional clay pot rice and hand-pulled noodles that had been the Golden Phoenix's specialty since 1962. Emma worked 16-hour days, arriving before dawn to prep vegetables and start the rice cookers, staying late into the night to balance books that never seemed to balance. She had dropped out of her MBA program at San Francisco State 2 years ago when her grandmother Li Wei's cancer treatment had overwhelmed the family's medical insurance. The student loans were still there, accumulating interest like a slowly growing tumor, but the degree would have to wait. Family came first. It always had in the Chen household. The businessman at the corner table was Vincent Ashford, though Emma didn't recognize him immediately. His face appeared regularly in the business section of the Chronicle, usually accompanying stories about his latest casino acquisition or real estate development project that had displaced another working-class community. Ashford Entertainment Group owned gambling establishments from Reno to Atlantic City, luxury resorts in the Caribbean, and entertainment complexes across Asia. His personal wealth was estimated somewhere north of $2 billion. and he wielded that fortune like a weapon against anyone who stood in his way. Ashford had chosen the Golden Phoenix not for its ambience, which was modest at best, but for its reputation among locals for serving the most authentic Cantonese cuisine in Chinatown. He ate methodically, occasionally checking his phone to monitor stock prices and approve acquisition deals, radiating the quiet confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to take whatever he wanted. Every few minutes, his pale green eyes would scan the restaurant with the calculating assessment of a predator evaluating potential territory for expansion. Emma approached his table with the traditional pot of jasmine tea, her professional smile masking the exhaustion that had become her constant companion since her grandmother's death. The smile was a survival skill learned from 3 generations of women who had served customers while carrying the weight of their own struggles. "Morty, sir?" Ashford glanced up from his phone, his pale green eyes conducting the brief, dismissive assessment of someone who viewed service workers as functional scenery rather than human beings with their own stories and dreams. "Please, and bring me the check when you get a chance. I have a conference call in 20 minutes. As Emma poured the fragrant tea, its steam rising like incense in the restaurant's warm air, Ashford reached into his vest pocket to check what appeared to be an expensive platinum pocket watch. The gesture was casual, automatic, the unconscious movement of someone accustomed to dividing his attention between multiple priorities. But what Emma saw made her hands freeze mid-pour, the delicate stream of tea spattering onto the white tablecloth like drops of liquid amber. Hanging from his platinum watch chain was a small jade pendant carved in the shape of a dragon. The dragon was exquisite, a masterpiece of traditional Chinese craftsmanship that spoke of centuries of artistic tradition. Its scales were individually detailed, each one catching the light with subtle variations in the jade's natural coloring. The dragon's whiskers flowed like silk ribbons frozen in stone, and its eyes were made of tiny rubies that seemed to glow with inner fire, as if the mythical creature might come to life at any moment. The craftsmanship was so fine that Emma could see the individual claws on each foot, the intricate patterns along the creature's serpentine body, and the flowing mane that marked it as the imperial dragon, rather than the simpler designs mass-produced for tourists. But it wasn't the beauty of the piece that made Emma's breath catch in her throat. It was the inscription she could just make out along the dragon's undulating body, characters that spelled Chen family in elegant Chinese calligraphy, brushstrokes that had been carefully carved by someone who understood both the language and the artistry required to create something that would last for generations. Below the family name, in smaller characters, was inscribed "Strength through generations, wisdom through adversity," the Chen family motto that Li Wei had recited to Emma countless times during her childhood. Emma's mind reeled as memories flooded back with devastating clarity. She had seen that exact pendant before, had held it in her own hands on countless occasions throughout her childhood and adolescence. Her grandmother, Li Wei Chen, had worn it every day until her death 2 years ago, claiming it was the last piece of jewelry she had brought from China in 1962, when she fled Hong Kong under circumstances she had never fully explained. Li Wei had told Emma stories about the dragon pendant, how it had been carved by her own great-grandfather, Master Chen Wu, a renowned artisan in Guangzhou who had created jade pieces for wealthy merchants and government officials during the late Qing dynasty. According to Li Wei's stories, the pendant represented more than just craftsmanship. It was a symbol of the Chen family's resilience through generations of hardship, their ability to adapt and survive while maintaining their cultural identity and values. The dragon was a guardian spirit, Li Wei had explained, watching over the Chen family and guiding them through times of difficulty. She had promised that one day the pendant would pass to Emma, along with the stories and responsibilities that came with being the keeper of family history. But Li Wei had been forced to sell the pendant 6 months before her death, when the medical bills from her cancer treatment had overwhelmed the family's savings and insurance coverage. Emma remembered that terrible day when her grandmother, weakened by chemotherapy and barely able to sit up in her hospital bed, had reluctantly handed the precious heirloom to Marcus Sullivan, a dealer in rare Asian antiquities who operated out of an upscale gallery in Union Square. Li had cried as she signed the bill of sale, her tears falling onto the jade dragon's surface like a benediction and a farewell. "This is the hardest thing I've ever done," Li Wei had whispered to Emma that day, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the oxygen machine that had become her constant companion. "I'm trading away our family's soul for a few more months of life. But maybe someday you'll understand that some sacrifices are necessary to protect the people we love." Emma had tried to convince her grandmother to keep the pendant, offering to take out additional student loans or find a second job to cover the medical expenses. But Li Wei had been adamant. The cancer treatment might give her another year, maybe 2 if they were lucky. The pendant could provide the $50,000 they needed to pay for the experimental treatment that offered their last hope. The choice, she said, was no choice at all. Emma had held her grandmother's hand as Marcus Sullivan examined the pendant with a jeweler's loupe, his professional demeanor unable to hide his excitement at acquiring such a significant piece. 18th century jade, exceptional craftsmanship, he had murmured, his voice carrying the reverence of someone who understood the historical and artistic significance of what he was purchasing. The carving technique suggests it was made by one of the master artisans who worked for the imperial court. This inscription, it's a family name and motto. These pieces were usually commissioned by wealthy merchant families as symbols of their prosperity and cultural refinement. Emma remembered wanting to scream at the dealer that he was wrong, that the pendant wasn't just a historical artifact to be catalogued and sold to the highest bidder. It was her great-great-grandfather's legacy, a tangible connection to ancestors she would never know, but whose blood ran through her veins. It was the last physical reminder of a culture and heritage that her family had fought to preserve through decades of discrimination, economic hardship, and cultural erasure. But they had needed the money more than the history, and Marcus Sullivan had written them a check on the spot. The pendant had disappeared into his gallery's inventory, and Li Wei had used the money to pay for 3 more months of treatment that had ultimately failed to save her life. Now, seeing the pendant hanging from Vincent Ashford's watch chain like a trophy of conquest, Emma felt a rage so pure and focused it made her hands tremble. This wasn't just about a piece of jewelry that had been sold during desperate times. This was about a systematic pattern of cultural appropriation, about wealthy collectors who treated Asian families' most precious heirlooms as exotic decorations for their own aggrandizement. "I'm sorry about the tea," Emma managed, dabbing at the spilled liquid with her cloth while trying to control the tremor in her voice. "That's a beautiful pendant you're wearing. Is it a family piece?" Ashford's hand moved instinctively to the jade dragon, his manicured fingers closing over it protectively. The casual dismissal that had characterized his demeanor throughout the evening evaporated instantly, replaced by something sharper and more alert. His pale green eyes, which had barely acknowledged Emma's existence moments before, now studied her with the focused intensity of a businessman who had just heard a competitor mention proprietary information. When he looked at Emma now, he no longer saw a waitress in a faded uniform serving tea in a modest restaurant. He saw a potential threat to something he valued, though he couldn't yet articulate what that threat might represent. The transformation in his attention was complete and unsettling, like watching a sleeping predator suddenly become aware of movement in its territory. "It belonged to my grandfather," he said curtly, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone unaccustomed to having his possessions questioned by service workers. "Robert Ashford acquired it during his extensive business dealings in Hong Kong in the 1960s. It's been carefully preserved in the family collection ever since, documented and appraised by some of the finest experts in Asian antiquities. The response was too detailed, too defensive for a casual inquiry about jewelry. Emma could hear the underlying tension in his voice, the way he emphasized words like documented and preserved, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. There was something rehearsed about his explanation, as if he had given similar responses before to similar questions. "That's interesting," Emma pressed, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was certain he could hear it echoing through the restaurant's quiet atmosphere. "Because the inscription looks like it says Chen family in Chinese characters. My grandmother used to have an identical piece. She said it was carved by her great-grandfather in Guangzhou, and that it was one of a kind, made specifically for our family lineage." Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued, drawing courage from the memory of Li Wei's pride when she would tell the stories of their ancestors. "She used to trace those characters with her finger and tell me about Master Chen Wu, who carved dragons for imperial officials but made this special piece for his own descendants. She said the inscription wasn't just our name. It was a promise that the Chen family would endure no matter what hardships we faced." The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop 10 degrees. The elderly couple at the corner table glanced over with mild curiosity, sensing the tension that had suddenly materialized between the well-dressed customer and their usual waitress. Even the college students looked up from their textbooks, their conversation trailing off as they unconsciously registered the shift in the room's atmosphere. Ashford's green eyes locked onto hers with laser intensity, no longer seeing a waitress, but recognizing something far more dangerous, someone who possessed knowledge that could complicate his carefully ordered world. The casual indifference was gone completely now, replaced by the predatory focus of a man who had built his fortune by identifying threats early and neutralizing them before they could cause damage. "I think you're mistaken," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his version of events accepted without question. "This pendant has been professionally documented in the Ashford family collection for over 50 years. Whatever similarity you think you see is purely coincidental. Asian artisans often use similar motifs and techniques. It's entirely possible that multiple pieces might bear superficial resemblances." But Emma could see uncertainty flickering behind his confident facade, a momentary crack in the armor of absolute certainty he wore like an expensive suit. His hand remained protectively closed over the pendant, and she noticed the slight tremor in his fingers. Not fear, exactly, but the nervous energy of someone whose assumptions were being challenged in an unexpected way. The explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears, and they both knew it. Emma had been too specific about the inscription, too detailed in her knowledge of the piece's history. This wasn't the vague recognition of similar artistic styles that he was trying to dismiss. This was intimate familiarity with a specific piece, knowledge that could only come from years of close observation and family stories passed down through generations. "My grandmother Li Wei Chen immigrated to San Francisco in 1962, Emma continued, finding courage she didn't know she possessed, her voice growing steadier with each word as she channeled the strength her grandmother had shown throughout her life. She had to sell that pendant last year to pay for her cancer treatment at UCSF. She told me it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, giving up the last piece of her father's artistic legacy, the last tangible connection to the family we lost in China." Emma's eyes began to well with tears, but her voice remained strong and clear. She held it in her hands one final time before the dealer took it away, and she made me promise that someday, when I was strong enough and brave enough, I would find out what really happened to our family's treasures. She said they weren't just stolen, they were taken by men who thought Chinese immigrants were too powerless to fight back. Ashford stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the worn linoleum floor with a harsh sound that cut through the restaurant's quiet atmosphere like a blade. The sudden movement startled the elderly couple, who looked up with alarm at the well-dressed man who had seemed so calm and controlled just moments before. He pulled out his wallet an expensive leather piece that probably cost more than Emma made in a month, and extracted several $100 bills with sharp, angry movements. He dropped the money on the table with contemptuous precision, each bill placed with the calculated care of someone making a statement rather than simply paying for a meal. It was far more than his dinner had cost, but it wasn't generosity, it was an insult, payment designed to reduce their entire interaction to a simple economic transaction that could be dismissed and forgotten. "Young lady," he said, his voice low and menacing, carrying undertones that made the college students at the nearby table unconsciously lean away from the conversation. "I suggest you be very careful about making accusations you cannot prove. The Ashford family has built its reputation over 3 generations on integrity and legitimate business practices. We don't tolerate slander from anyone, especially those who have nothing to lose and everything to gain from fabricating convenient stories." The threat was elegantly phrased but unmistakable in its implications. Ashford was a man who controlled newspapers, influenced politicians, and had the resources to destroy anyone who challenged his family's carefully constructed narrative. The subtext was clear: continue this line of inquiry and face consequences that would extend far beyond a simple conversation in a restaurant. He retrieved his overcoat, a perfectly tailored cashmere piece that probably cost more than Emma's family made in 6 months, and walked toward the door with measured steps, each footfall echoing with the authority of someone who was accustomed to having the final word in every conversation. "Young lady," he said, his voice low and menacing, "I suggest you be very careful about making accusations you cannot prove. The Ashford family has built its reputation on integrity and legitimate business practices. We don't tolerate slander from anyone, especially those who have nothing to lose." He retrieved his overcoat and walked toward the door, but Emma's voice followed him across the small dining room. "If that pendant really belonged to your grandfather, then why haven't you had the Chinese inscription translated?" "Because you'd find out it doesn't say Ashford anywhere on it." Ashford froze at the door, his hand on the brass handle. For a long moment, the restaurant was completely silent, except for the soft hiss of the kitchen's gas burners and the distant sound of traffic on Grant Avenue. When Ashford turned back to face her, his expression was no longer coldly dismissive. It was calculating, dangerous, and absolutely focused. "Prove it," he said quietly. The door chimed softly as he left, leaving Emma standing in the middle of her family's restaurant, with her heart pounding and the terrible certainty that she had just challenged one of the most powerful men in California. The $100 bills on the table felt like a gauntlet thrown down, payment for a meal he hadn't finished, and a conversation that might have just sealed her fate. But as Emma looked around the Golden Phoenix, at the faded photographs of her grandparents' wedding, at the traditional calligraphy scrolls her great-grandfather had painted, at the red and gold decorations that had welcomed 3 generations of customers, she realized she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every immigrant family that had been displaced by gentrification, every small business that had been crushed by corporate greed, every piece of cultural heritage that had been stolen and sold to the highest bidder. The jade dragon had found its way back to her, even if she couldn't prove it yet. And if Vincent Ashford thought he could intimidate her into silence, he was about to learn that Chen family strength ran deeper than Ashford money. The photographs that David spread across the table told a story that Li Wei had never shared with Emma, a narrative of prosperity, betrayal, and systematic destruction that had been hidden for over 50 years. The first image was a formal portrait of the Chen family taken in 1961, showing Li Wei as a young woman in an elegant qipao dress standing beside a distinguished man in a Western suit. Behind them stretched an opulent showroom filled with jade sculptures, silk tapestries, and traditional Chinese artwork that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth and cultural refinement. "That's your great-grandfather, Chen Wei-ming," David said, pointing to the man in the photograph. "And that was the Chen Trading Company headquarters in Hong Kong. Your family wasn't just middle-class merchants, Emma. They were one of the most successful importers of Chinese antiques and artwork in Southeast Asia. The business had been built over 4 generations, starting with your great-great-grandfather, who began as a humble jade carver in Guangzhou. Emma studied the photograph with growing amazement. The showroom was vast and elegant, with glass display cases showcasing pieces that would have been at home in major museums. Traditional Chinese paintings hung on silk-covered walls, and carved wooden furniture suggested a level of sophistication she had never associated with her family's history. This collection, David continued, pulling out a detailed inventory, written in both Chinese and English, was worth approximately $2 million in 1962 currency. In today's money, we're talking about $15 to $20 million of rare antiques, jade sculptures and cultural artifacts. He pulled out another document, this one a business license, showing that the Chen Trading Company held exclusive import agreements with several mainland Chinese provinces, giving them access to pieces that were becoming increasingly rare as political upheaval made cultural exports more difficult. Your great-grandfather wasn't just a collector, David explained. He was a cultural preservationist who understood that many of these pieces would be destroyed or lost forever if they weren't carefully preserved and documented. Museums around the world, private collectors in Europe and America, they all came to Chen Wei-ming when they wanted authentic pieces with verifiable provenance. Emma's mind reeled as she absorbed this revelation. Her grandmother had always described the family as poor refugees who had lost everything in the war, farmers and laborers who had come to America with nothing but hope and determination. The reality was completely different. They had been wealthy cultural guardians whose expertise and connections had made them influential players in the international art market. What happened to all of this? Emma asked, though she was beginning to understand that the answer would be painful. David pulled out a series of business letters dated throughout 1962, written on official letterhead from Ashford International Acquisitions. The early correspondence was polite and professional, with Robert Ashford expressing interest in purchasing specific pieces for a distinguished American collector who wishes to remain anonymous. As the months progressed, however, the tone became increasingly aggressive and demanding. Robert Ashford arrived in Hong Kong in January 1962, David explained, claiming to represent wealthy American collectors who were interested in building comprehensive Chinese art collections. At first, your great-grandfather was happy to work with him. Ashford seemed knowledgeable about Chinese culture, and he paid fair prices for the pieces he selected. Emma read over, Ashford's shoulder as her father translated, sections of the Chinese correspondence. The early letters showed Chen Wei-ming's enthusiasm for sharing his cultural knowledge with Western collectors who seemed genuinely interested in preserving Chinese artistic traditions. But by summer, Ashford's requests had changed, David continued, pulling out letters from June and July 1962. He was no longer interested in individual pieces. He wanted to acquire the entire Chen family collection, every piece in the showroom, including items that had been designated as family heirlooms, never intended for sale. The letters from this period showed a dramatic shift in tone. Ashford's requests became demands. His language shifted from respectful admiration to barely concealed threats. In one particularly ominous letter, dated August 15, 1962, Ashford wrote, "Mr. Chen, the political situation in Hong Kong is becoming increasingly unstable. Families who fail to adapt to changing circumstances often find themselves in untenable positions. I strongly advise you to reconsider my generous offer before external forces make such decisions for you." "What kind of external forces?" Emma asked, though she dreaded the answer. David pulled out a police report filed by Chen Wei-ming in September 1962, describing a pattern of intimidation that had begun affecting the family's daily life. Their showroom had been broken into twice. Though nothing had been stolen, the intruders had simply ransacked the displays and left threatening messages written in English. Li Wei had been followed by Western men in expensive suits who made no attempt to hide their surveillance. Business associates had begun cancelling appointments and avoiding the Chen family, claiming they had received warnings about continuing their relationships. "Your great-grandfather reported all of this to the Hong Kong police," David said, "but the colonial authorities were reluctant to investigate crimes that involved wealthy Western businessmen. The police suggested that the Chen family might be safer if they resolved their business disputes through private negotiation rather than involving law enforcement." The implication was clear. Robert Ashford had enough influence with colonial officials to ensure that his activities would not face serious scrutiny from local authorities. Emma studied a photograph taken inside the Chen showroom after one of the break-ins. Display cases had been shattered, priceless pieces lay scattered across the floor, and Chinese characters had been spray-painted on the walls, characters that David translated as "foreign devils welcome here" and "sell or suffer." "The final escalation came in November," David said, his voice growing quieter as he approached the most painful part of the story. Ashford made one last offer to purchase the entire collection at a fraction of its value, giving your great-grandfather 24 hours to accept or face consequences that would extend beyond simple business disagreements. He pulled out the last document in the envelope, a death certificate for Chen Wei-ming, dated December 3, 1962, listing cause of death as accidental drowning during heavy weather conditions. The certificate was signed by a British colonial official and witnessed by two men whose signatures were illegible. The official story was that your great-grandfather had taken his boat out to inspect a shipment that was arriving from the mainland, David explained. According to witnesses, his boat capsized in rough seas and his body wasn't recovered for 3 days. But Li Wei never believed it was an accident. He pulled out one final photograph that made Emma's blood run cold. It showed the Chen Trading Company showroom in January 1963, completely empty, except for a few broken display cases and a single sign reading, "Premises available for lease. Contact Ashford International Acquisitions." Within a month of your great-grandfather's death, David said, every piece in the Chen collection had been donated to various American museums and private collectors. The donations were all attributed to the estate of Robert Ashford, as if he had been the original owner of pieces that had been in the Chen family for generations. Emma stared at the evidence spread across the table, understanding finally why her grandmother had lived in fear for 50 years, why Li Wei had always warned her to be careful around powerful men with expensive lawyers, why the family had struggled in poverty despite having once possessed wealth that could have supported them for generations. The jade dragon pendant, Emma said slowly, was the only piece Nai managed to save. She hid it in her clothing when she fled Hong Kong, David confirmed. It was meant to be proof, evidence that the Chen family had owned the collection that Robert Ashford claimed as his own. But she was too afraid to ever use it, too terrified that speaking out would bring the same fate that had befallen your great-grandfather. The next morning dawned grey and foggy, with the kind of penetrating chill that made San Francisco feel more like a seaside village than a major metropolitan city. Emma had barely slept, her mind churning with questions about the jade dragon and what Vincent Ashford's possession of it might mean. She arrived at the Golden Phoenix before sunrise, as she did every morning, to prep vegetables and start the rice cookers for the day ahead. The restaurant felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, smaller somehow, more fragile. Emma moved through the familiar routines of opening, but her thoughts kept returning to her grandmother's stories about the pendant and the circumstances that had forced Li Wei to sell it. At 8 o'clock, Emma called the one person who might be able to help her understand what she had stumbled into, Professor James Liu at UC Berkeley's Asian Studies Department. Professor Liu had been a friend of her grandmother's, a fellow immigrant from Guangzhou who had become one of the foremost experts on Chinese-American history in California. "Emma," Professor Liu's warm voice came through the phone, "how are you holding up?" I know the restaurant has been struggling since your grandmother passed. Professor Liu, I need your help with something. It's about Grandma's jade dragon pendant, the one she had to sell before she died. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What about it? I saw it last night. A businessman named Vincent Ashford was wearing it, claiming it belonged to his family. He said his grandfather acquired it in Hong Kong in the 1960s. Professor Liu was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was tight with concern. Emma, are you certain it was the same pendant? Absolutely certain. Same dragon carving, same ruby eyes, same Chinese inscription. But Professor, there's something else Grandma never told me, isn't there? About how she really came to America, and why she was so afraid of powerful businessmen. Another pause, longer this time. Emma, can you meet me at my office this afternoon? There are things about your grandmother's story, about your family's history, that she made me promise never to discuss unless you came asking the right questions. I think you just asked them. 4 hours later, Emma sat in Professor Liu's cluttered office in Dwinell Hall, surrounded by stacks of books, historical documents, and photographs that chronicled the Chinese-American experience in California. Professor Liu, a distinguished man in his 70s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, poured tea from a delicate porcelain set and settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone preparing to reveal long-held secrets. Your grandmother, Li Wei, was not just another immigrant seeking a better life in America, Professor Liu began. She was fleeing something specific, something that haunted her until the day she died. He pulled out a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. In 1962, your grandmother's family owned one of the most successful trading companies in Hong Kong. The Chen Trading Company specialized in importing jade, silk, and traditional crafts from mainland China to sell to collectors and dealers around the world. Emma leaned forward, fascinated. Her grandmother had always described herself as coming from a poor family that had lost everything during the war. The Chen family had built their business over 3 generations, Professor Liu continued, and they were particularly known for their collection of antique jade pieces, including family heirlooms that had been passed down for centuries. The dragon pendant you saw was one of those pieces, not just valuable as an artifact, but irreplaceable as a symbol of the Chen family's heritage. What happened to the business? Emma asked, though she dreaded the answer. Professor Liu opened the folder and pulled out a black and white photograph. It showed a young Li Wei standing next to a handsome man in a Western suit, both of them smiling at the camera. Behind them, Emma could see the interior of what appeared to be an upscale shop filled with jade sculptures, silk hangings, and traditional Chinese artwork. That's your grandfather, Chen Wei-ming, Professor Liu explained. And that was the Chen Trading Company showroom in Hong Kong, taken in early 1962. By the end of that year, everything you see in that photograph was gone. Gone how? Professor Liu pulled out another document, this one typewritten on official letterhead. This is a police report filed by your grandfather in November 1962. He reported that he had been approached by an American businessman named Robert Ashford, who wanted to acquire the Chen family's entire jade collection for a private collector in the United States. Emma's blood ran cold at the familiar name. Vincent Ashford's grandfather. When your grandfather refused to sell, the pieces were family heirlooms, not merchandise, Ashford began applying pressure. First financial pressure, then legal harassment, and finally, Professor Liu hesitated. Finally what? Physical intimidation. Your grandfather reported receiving death threats, having his shop vandalized, and being followed by men who made it clear that his family was not safe in Hong Kong. Professor Liu pulled out the final document in the folder. A ship manifest dated December 1962, listing Li Wei Chen as a passenger aboard a cargo ship bound for San Francisco. Your grandmother fled Hong Kong with nothing but the clothes on her back and the jade dragon pendant hidden in her luggage. Your grandfather stayed behind to try to save the business, but Professor Liu's voice trailed off. But what happened to him? He died in a car accident 3 weeks after Li Wei arrived in San Francisco. The Hong Kong police ruled it accidental, but your grandmother always believed Robert Ashford had arranged it. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Her grandmother hadn't just lost her homeland and her family's business. She had lost her husband to what appeared to be murder, disguised as an accident. "So the jade collection," Emma said slowly, "including my grandmother's pendant, was stolen by Robert Ashford and brought to the United States, where it formed the foundation of the Ashford family's supposed expertise in Asian antiquities," Professor Liu finished. "Your grandmother spent 40 years afraid to speak publicly about what happened, terrified that the Ashford family would finish what they started if she ever tried to reclaim what was stolen." Emma stared at the documents spread across Professor Liu's desk, pieces of a puzzle that revealed a story far more tragic and complex than she had ever imagined. The jade dragon wasn't just a family heirloom that had been sold during hard times. It was evidence of a systematic campaign of intimidation, theft, and possibly murder that had destroyed the Chen family and built the foundation of the Ashford fortune. "Professor Liu," Emma said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her, "do you have any idea how much the Chen family's collection would be worth today?" Professor Liu consulted a thick reference book on Chinese antiquities. "Conservative estimate, assuming the pieces are authentic and well-preserved, $50 to $70 million. And that's just the monetary value. The cultural and historical significance is incalculable." Emma felt the weight of 3 generations of injustice settling on her shoulders. Her grandmother had died believing that her family's killers would never be held accountable, that the truth would die with her. But Li Wei had been wrong about one thing. She had raised a granddaughter who would not be intimidated into silence. "I need to see those police records," Emma said. "All of them. And I need to find out if there are any other survivors from the Chen Trading Company who might be willing to testify about what really happened." Professor Liu smiled for the first time since Emma had arrived at his office. "I was hoping you would say that. Your grandmother would be very proud of you." Meanwhile, across the bay, in his glass and steel office overlooking San Francisco Bay, Vincent Ashford was experiencing the most uncomfortable morning of his adult life. The encounter with Emma Chen at the Golden Phoenix had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Not because of her accusations, which were clearly the desperate fantasies of someone facing financial hardship, but because of the certainty in her voice when she had spoken about the pendant. Ashford pulled the jade dragon from his vest pocket and examined it carefully. He had worn it for nearly 20 years, ever since his father had given it to him as a college graduation gift, calling it a symbol of the family's success in international business. The dragon was beautiful, masterfully carved, but Ashford had never paid close attention to the Chinese characters etched along its body. Now, sitting in his office with San Francisco's Chinatown visible in the distance, he found himself wondering what those characters actually said. If Emma Chen was right, and the inscription really did say Chen family, then how had his grandfather acquired it? And why had his family's official history always been so vague about the details of Robert Ashford's business dealings in Asia? Ashford picked up his phone and called his personal attorney David Kim, a Korean-American lawyer who had handled the Ashford family's legal affairs for over a decade. "David, I need you to pull all the records related to my grandfather's business activities in Hong Kong and China during the 1960s. Specifically, I want to see documentation for how he acquired his collection of Asian antiquities. Vincent, those records are over 50 years old. Most of them are probably in storage. What's this about? Someone has raised questions about the provenance of some family pieces. I want to make sure our documentation is complete and accurate. I'll see what I can find, but it may take a few days to locate files that old. Is this urgent?" Ashford looked down at the jade dragon in his hand, its ruby eyes seeming to stare back at him with silent accusation. "Yes, David, it's urgent." After he hung up, Ashford walked to his office windows and stared out at the city. Somewhere in Chinatown, Emma Chen was probably researching her family's history, trying to piece together a story that had been buried for 50 years. If she was right about the pendant, she might also be right about other aspects of her family's past. For the first time in his adult life, Vincent Ashford wondered if his family's fortune had been built on something more sinister than shrewd business deals and fortunate timing. And if Emma Chen could prove it, she wouldn't just be claiming a piece of jewelry. She would be claiming justice for a crime that had been covered up for half a century. That evening, Emma closed the Golden Phoenix early and made her way to the basement storage room, where her grandmother had kept boxes of old photographs, documents, and mementos from the old country. Li Wei had always been reluctant to discuss these items, dismissing them as old sadness whenever Emma had shown interest in her family's history. Now, armed with the knowledge Professor Liu had shared, Emma began going through the boxes with new understanding. In a shoebox wrapped in silk scarves, she found what she was looking for: photographs, letters, and business documents that her grandmother had secretly preserved for 50 years. The photographs were revelatory. Image after image showed the Chen Trading Company in its heyday. Elegant showrooms filled with jade sculptures, silk tapestries, and traditional artwork. Emma's grandparents looked prosperous and happy, surrounded by the fruits of generations of family enterprise. But it was the business correspondence that provided the smoking gun Emma needed. In a folder marked 1962 Final Year, she found copies of letters between her grandfather and Robert Ashford, documenting Ashford's increasingly aggressive attempts to acquire the Chen family collection. The early letters were polite business inquiries. Ashford expressed interest in purchasing specific pieces for a discriminating collector in the United States. When Chen Wei-ming politely declined, explaining that the pieces were family heirlooms not for sale, Ashford's tone became more insistent. By October 1962, the letters had become openly threatening. In one particularly chilling document, Ashford warned that business conditions in Hong Kong could become quite difficult for families who failed to recognize changing circumstances. Another letter suggested that Chen Wei-ming's stubborn attachment to the past was putting his family in danger. The final letter, dated November 15, 1962, was brief and ominous. "Mr. Chen, my patience has reached its end. You will transfer the jade collection to my representatives by month's end, or face the consequences of your foolish pride." Chen Wei-ming had died in his accident on December 3, 1962. Emma sat in the basement storage room, surrounded by the documentary evidence of her family's destruction, feeling the weight of 50 years of injustice pressing down on her. But she also felt something else: the strength her grandmother had passed down, the resilience that had allowed Li Wei to survive the loss of everything she had known and build a new life in a foreign country. Emma pulled out her phone and began making calls, first to Professor Liu, then to 3 investigative journalists who specialized in corporate crime, and finally to Catherine Wong, a civil rights attorney who had built her reputation representing Asian American families in discrimination cases. By morning, the story of the Chen family's stolen legacy would be public. Vincent Ashford would no longer be able to suppress the truth with legal threats and financial pressure. The court of public opinion would hear about Chen Wei-ming and his murdered dreams, and Emma Chen would finally have the ammunition she needed to reclaim her family's honor and bring down the empire built on her grandfather's bones. The Jade Dragon had pointed her home at last, not to a place, but to the truth that would set 3 generations of women free. 3 days later, the story broke simultaneously in the San Francisco Chronicle, the Asian Week newspaper, and on local television news. The headline in the Chronicle read, "Chinatown restaurant owner claims casino mogul's fortune built on theft and murder." The accompanying article, written by investigative journalist Michael Torres, laid out the evidence Emma and Professor Liu had compiled with devastating clarity. The public reaction was immediate and intense. The story tapped into long, simmering tensions about gentrification in Chinatown, the displacement of immigrant families by wealthy developers, and the historical pattern of Asian American businesses being targeted by discriminatory practices. Social media exploded with support for Emma's cause, using hashtags like Justice Fortune Family and Return the Dragon. But the real drama was playing out behind closed doors in the boardroom of Ashford Entertainment Group, where Vincent Ashford faced a crisis that threatened to destroy everything his family had built over 3 generations. Margaret Sullivan, the company's longest-serving board member, spoke for the group. "Vincent, if this story gains traction, it could destroy our reputation in every market where we operate. Our casino licenses, our international partnerships, our relationships with regulators, all of it could be compromised if we're seen as a company built on stolen assets and murder." Ashford sat at the head of the polished conference table, the jade dragon pendant now locked in his desk drawer like an accusation he could no longer bear to wear. He had spent the past 72 hours consulting with crisis management specialists, all of whom had delivered the same sobering assessment. The evidence against his family was compelling and potentially devastating. "The historical record is becoming clearer," reported his attorney David Kim. "Robert Ashford's business dealings in Hong Kong were shadowy at best, and there are significant gaps in the documentation that suggest deliberate destruction of records." Board member Thomas Hayes leaned forward with barely controlled anger. "Are you telling us that this entire company could be compromised because your grandfather may have been involved in theft and murder 50 years ago?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Kim replied grimly. "And it gets worse. The FBI has opened a preliminary investigation into the acquisition of stolen cultural artifacts, and the Hong Kong authorities have agreed to cooperate by providing their historical files on the Chen family case." The room fell silent, except for the sound of expensive pens clicking nervously. These were people accustomed to controlling situations through money and influence, but they were facing something that couldn't be bought: historical truth, backed by federal law enforcement. "What do you propose we do?" Margaret Sullivan asked. Ashford looked around the table at faces that had once regarded him with respect, now reflecting suspicion and barely concealed panic. "I propose we do the right thing," Ashford said quietly. "We acknowledge what happened. We make full restitution to Emma Chen for her family's losses. And we restructure this company to operate legitimately going forward." Thomas Hayes slammed his hand on the table. "You want us to voluntarily destroy everything we've worked for to satisfy the demands of a restaurant owner who stumbled onto some old documents?" "That restaurant owner is the rightful heir to assets worth approximately $50 million, Ashford replied. "She could take everything through the courts and leave us with nothing. I'm suggesting we negotiate while we still have something left." Meanwhile, across town, Emma sat surrounded by legal documents and 3 expensive attorneys. Catherine Wong, a senior partner at San Francisco's most prestigious civil rights law firm, had convinced Emma she was dealing with something much bigger than imagined. "Ms. Chen," Wong had explained, "based on the documents you've provided, you have a legitimate claim to what may be the largest cultural repatriation case in California history. We're not talking about recovering a pendant. We're talking about recovering 50 years of profits from an entire collection." Now surrounded by legal experts mapping out the Ashford family's crimes, Emma was beginning to understand what her grandfather had lost and what she stood to recover. The jade collection alone would be worth approximately $50 million, explained art recovery attorney Lisa Park. "Then there's the question of punitive damages for the systematic campaign of intimidation and the suspected murder of your grandfather." Emma looked at the financial projections. "How much are we talking about total?" "Conservative estimate? $150 million, plus compound interest and punitive damages. We're talking about potentially the largest restitution case in California legal history." The number was staggering. Emma Chen, who had been struggling to keep her family's restaurant afloat just a week ago, was potentially one of the wealthiest people in San Francisco. But looking around at the lawyers who saw dollar signs and fame, Emma felt sadness rather than excitement. The money wouldn't bring back her grandfather or undo 50 years of her family's exile and poverty. "What I want isn't just money," she said finally. "I want the truth to be acknowledged. I want my grandfather's name cleared. And I want to make sure that what happened to the Chen family never happens to another immigrant family." Wong nodded approvingly. "Those are admirable goals, Emma. But you need to understand, Vincent Ashford will fight this with everything he has. They'll hire the best lawyers, discredit the evidence, and paint you as someone trying to profit from historical grievances." "Let them try," Emma said firmly. "I have the truth on my side, and I have something else they don't have." "What's that?" Emma pulled the jade dragon pendant from her purse. Not Vincent Ashford's stolen piece, but a photograph of the original that Professor Liu had found in the Chen family archives. "I have proof that the dragon never belonged to them. And I have witnesses who remember my grandfather and what really happened to him." 2 months later, the legal battle had captured national attention as a symbol of historical injustice and corporate accountability. The courtroom was packed with reporters and legal observers invested in Emma's fight for justice. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Catherine Wong called Vincent Ashford to the stand. Ashford had initially resisted testifying, but Wong had successfully argued that as the current beneficiary of his grandfather's crimes, he was a necessary witness. Ashford took the stand in an expensive navy suit, but his usual authority had been replaced by tense defensiveness. He answered Wong's initial questions with clipped, careful responses. But Wong knew exactly how to break through Ashford's defenses. "Mr. Ashford," she said, approaching with a document, "I'm showing you Plaintiff's Exhibit 23. Do you recognize this document?" Ashford examined the paper, and his face went ashen. It was one of his grandfather's threatening letters to Chen Wei-ming, with a handwritten note in the margin: "If he won't sell, we'll take what we need and eliminate the problem. This appears to be correspondence between your grandfather and Mr. Chen," Ashford said, his voice tight with anger. "Correspondence in which your grandfather explicitly threatens to eliminate the problem of Mr. Chen's refusal to sell his family's jade collection," Wong corrected. "Mr. Ashford, were you aware that your family's fortune was built on theft and murder?" The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, their faces showed the gravity of the decision they had reached. The foreman stood with visible emotion. On the question of whether the Chen family was the rightful owner of the jade collection claimed by the Ashford family, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the question of damages, we award Emma Chen the sum of $200 million, representing the current value of the stolen assets plus compound interest and punitive damages for the wrongful death of Chen Wei-ming. The courtroom erupted in sustained applause. Emma sat motionless, tears streaming down her face, as Catherine Wong embraced her and whispered, "You did it. You got justice for your family." After the courtroom cleared, Ashford approached Emma in the hallway outside. His attorneys tried to stop him, but he waved them away. "Ms. Chen," he said quietly, "I want you to know that what happened to your grandfather was wrong. What my grandfather did was monstrous, and my family has profited from that crime for 50 years. You deserve to know the truth, and you deserve justice." Emma looked at the man who had been her family's enemy, seeing not the arrogant billionaire she had confronted at the Golden Phoenix, but a human being who had discovered that his entire life had been built on a lie. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "I don't want to destroy you. I just wanted the truth to be told. And I want to make sure that companies can't profit from violence and theft without ever being held accountable." 6 months later, Emma stood in the renovated Golden Phoenix restaurant, now expanded into the adjacent buildings and bearing a bronze plaque that told the true story of Chen Wei-ming and his stolen legacy. The jade dragon pendant, returned by Vincent Ashford as part of the settlement, hung in a place of honor behind the register, a symbol of justice finally served. Emma had used part of her settlement to establish the Chen Wei Ming Foundation, which provided legal assistance to immigrant families facing corporate intimidation and helped preserve Asian American cultural heritage. The foundation had already helped dozens of families retain their businesses and properties against aggressive gentrification. The Golden Phoenix had become more than just a restaurant. It was a symbol of resilience, a place where the true stories of Chinatown's families were honored and remembered. This story reminds us that truth has a power that transcends time and wealth, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for money or power, but for dignity, justice, and the right to preserve our cultural heritage. Emma Chen's courage to confront a powerful family with evidence of their crimes shows us that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to be silenced by wealth and power. What would you have done in Emma's position? Would you have accepted a quiet settlement, or would you have fought for the complete truth, regardless of the personal cost? How important is it to preserve the stories of immigrant families who have been erased from official histories? Share your thoughts, and remember to subscribe for more stories of ordinary people finding the strength to fight impossible odds and win.